A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first start by thanking Scott for a very generous introduction and to the conference organizers for having me here. So I'm going to talk, given that the conference is on emerging markets. Do we have the slides? Yes. I think one of the key emerging markets that will remain quite relevant and hopefully become more relevant in your minds at the end of this presentation is India. And what I'm going to talk about is part of it, or good part of it, is from this book of mine that is forthcoming, India at 100. For those of you who are not aware, India got its independence in 1947. And so, India will celebrate its centenary year in 2047. That is 23 years from now. This book is essentially about what India will, or how India will look like when it celebrates its centenary year. I finished the draft of the book. The copy editing and all is going on, and hopefully by April it should hit the stands. So I'm going to give you a sense of what is there in the book. Of course, urge you to read it. Let me start by, I think, a prediction for India at 100, which I am sure will evoke emotions of incredulity from you, many of you. But having lived through making early contrarian predictions like the V-shaped recovery that Scott talked about. At that time, when this is, September of 2020, we've had the strongest lockdown, which is required given our health infrastructure and, pandemic, etc. GDP declined in that quarter by 24%. And 24%, it's never ever happened in the history of a 75-year history, and most likely will not happen in the next 100 years. And there I had to actually go and front up to the media, trying to, when everybody's spirits were really down, everybody, of course, in times like that, it is like, eagles were actually preying on the prey. So that's when I went and, said, there is a V-shaped recovery that is on. And I'm glad that turned out to be true, as the 7% plus growth, close to 10% in the year after, and then 7% plus growth in the next 2 years. And this year as well, predicted to be 7% growth, as clearly demonstrated. I think the making a prediction early on, which is contrarian, is similar to, being, let's say, if you're an entrepreneur who's bringing up a product which is different from or changes customers' thinking. So the early mover has advantages, but the early mover will also have skeptics. So I'm pretty sure that there will be skeptics here. Hopefully I can convince you, at least some of you who are skeptical at this point. The prediction I have is if India can grow at 8%, and that is, it's ambitious, but it's achievable. Why? Because in the last close to 3 decades, India has grown at 7% plus, in real terms. So from 7% to 8%, of course, is, it's not easy to move into it, especially, given the kind of problems that Scott talked about, which, you'll be debating about, whether it is, inward looking policies in many countries, climate change, and industrial policies in countries, global trade being questioned, etc. So there are, challenges there are, undoubtedly. But I think it is something which is achievable. China, for instance, in 2007 had a per capita GDP, which is actually very similar to, almost identical to ours now. And since then, despite the shocks due to the global financial crisis, China grew at close to 8% then in the next 2 decades. And so, that it can happen. So if India can grow at 8%, and as I said, it's ambitious but achievable, then India will be a $55 trillion economy in 2047. So that's the number that will actually manage. What? $55 trillion? Let me, if it is making you, sort of believe or disbelieve, I think it should, because that's an early contrarian prediction. Now, the kind of firms that come and hire here, two of them have actually made predictions, and EY predicts India to be a 20 close to $25 trillion economy in 2047. What I'm actually predicting is more than double that. Goldman Sachs predicts India to be a $50 trillion economy in 2075, which is almost 3 decades after I'm predicting. So clearly, given these predictions, you'll actually wonder, is this guy out of his mind? Is he nuts? So let me try and explain the logic. And the way, even for instance, whether it is early on predictions saying that there's nothing structurally wrong with the economy, or the V-shaped recovery, it helps to be a researcher, where you actually are taught to follow the Sherlock Holmes credo of theorize only after you have the data. You carefully look at the data and analyze it very well. I think having the prism of academic rigor, publishing in the top journals here, actually gives you that prism to be able to, ferret out the phenomenon before many others have actually looked at. So, and of course, a good understanding of the economy, the nuances of the economy. Based on that, so what I see as a sort of missing in these predictions, in the EY and the Goldman Sachs prediction, is in some sense it's a partial prediction, which is they are not taking into account the path for the rupee dollar from now till 2047, the depreciation that will happen in the currency, from here till 2047. So they're of course predicting at growth at 7% or 7% plus, but they're assuming that the depreciation of the currency will be what it has been in the past. And here, let me allow you to explain. I'm sure you've taken your classes in macro and monetary economics. So what I'm going to tell you, I'm sure the theoretical prism for that would have been taught in classes. So when you think about the depreciation, nominal depreciation of a currency, which is what affects the nominal level, the nominal depreciation of the currency is basically just that is a combination of two things: the real appreciation or depreciation in real terms, and you're all MBA students at a top school, so I don't need to tell you the difference between real and nominal. So real appreciation or depreciation of the currency, and the inflation differential, the difference in inflation. So historically, if you look at India, from 1991, and 1991 is a break in the economy because that's when India liberalized. If you look at over the last 3 decades, the annual depreciation of the rupee dollar has been between 3 to 3.5%, a little more sometimes, actually 3.5 to 4%. One of the key determinants of that has been the much higher inflation in India compared to the United States. United States, the inflation has been about 2% historically. India, on the other hand, if you take the data from 1960 to 2020, or even 1990 to 2020, inflation has been more than 7%. So that inflation differential has been more than 5%. 2% for the US, 7% for the for India. So I'm going to do these numbers in my head. Please make sure you actually are with me. So the difference actually is more than 5%. That's what has been historically been the case. So even though there has been appreciation of the currency in real terms, and that's because productivity growth has been catching up with the so there's been real appreciation of between 1 to 1.5%. Of the currency, because of the 5% plus inflation differential. So take 5%, subtract 1.5%, what you get is 3.5%. So there's been depreciation of the currency of 3.5%. So in the book, I have a chapter explaining this, auto sample, going and matching it. This is the now. There are 2 key changes that are happening, macro trends, which actually I think I have no hesitation in saying that possibly the first person to sort of talk about this. One is that India in 2017 implemented the inflation targeting framework. And I'm sure this must have been covered in macro. So most central banks are inflation targeters. The US here, the Fed basically targets inflation of 2%. In India, that framework requires the central bank to target inflation at 4% with a band of plus minus 2. In other words, between 2% to 6%. So the central bank actually has to deliver inflation of 4%, but I'm going to be conservative and say if we are going to grow, there might be periods where, let's say, the economy overheats. And so, it's possible that, so let's take inflation, going forward from now over the next 2.5 decades to be 5%, not 4%, which is the target that the central bank has to deliver. So 5% inflation, not the 7% plus inflation that has prevailed in the past. That itself gives you a 2% plus difference. So the inflation differential is going to be lower by about 2%, slightly more than 2%, which tells you then that, if I don't tell you anything else, and I'm going to tell you on the real part as well, that itself tells you what has been 3.5 to 4% depreciation of the currency is, will not be 3.5, will be actually 2% less, about 1.5% or so. Now add to that what is happening on the real economy, and this is something which is so. I'm sure your colleagues here who actually do research in economics, macroeconomics, actually will. I don't know whether in classes they actually show you, data from the Penworld tables. Most macroeconomists actually use Penworld tables to look at what is the contribution of capital to growth, what is the contribution of productivity, what's the contribution of labor. So when you look at that data, and actually it was quite sort of enlightening for me to look at that data. If you take from 2002 to 2013, the productivity growth, I'm not going to get into the technical aspects, but productivity, I'm sure you understand, MBAs who actually understand productivity. Productivity growth for India from 2002 to 2013 has been 1.3%. 1.3%. Just keep this, this number in mind. From 2014 onwards, and the last year for which this data is available is 2019. So 2014 onwards, the productivity growth has been 2.7%. So 1.3% versus 2.7% productivity growth. So in other words, productivity growth from 2014 onwards has been more than double. The immediate question that will come to your mind is that why has then the growth not been as high? It has been actually, growth has been close to 7%, but not higher than previous times. A very legitimate question. If you're getting that question, pat yourself on the back. Reason for growth not being as high, despite productivity being more than double, is because investment in the economy has declined. That itself was because of the financial sector problems that I told you I had to sort of grow and grapple with. So investment in the economy declined, which is why even though there's been an increase in productivity, significant increase in productivity, the growth has not been as commensurate because the investment rate in the economy declined significantly. Now, this is where I think the second, I'm able to sort of complete the circle. Starting from 2021 onwards, the COVID budget that I had the privilege of being involved in, India has actually started investing significantly more, especially in infrastructure. And the federal budgets that have come since then have actually continued that, in fact, redoubled by giving incentives to the states as well. India has a federal structure much like the United States. And so, in giving incentives to states also to invest in capital expenditures, infrastructure creation. So, and these are happening in areas like roads, railways, power, sectors that are very important. And, many times when infrastructure is created, the private investment, that creates the salutary conditions for private investment to come in. So if you look at the latest numbers, the overall gross fixed capital formation to GDP, gross fixed capital formation is basically macroeconomist jargon for investment in the economy. If you take the GFCF to GDP ratio, that is touching close to 37%, a little more than 37% now. And that tells me that with the productivity growth that has already happened. And why has it happened? Why is the productivity growth? Because of the several reforms that have been done, including the bankruptcy code, the huge public digital infrastructure that's been created. And I'll tell you a story about that just after finishing this part of my talk. So when you take the productivity growth, higher productivity growth with a higher investment that is likely to come, India can deliver 7% plus. But I think there'll be more reforms required in order to be able to do 8% consistently. So it is ambitious, but it is achievable. Now, as I said, Inflation actually, the difference in inflation is going to be about 2% less, and the growth in real incomes actually will be higher. As a result, what has been a 3.5 to 4% depreciation in the currency, every year from over the last, on average, over the last 3 decades, from now on, it actually is likely to be about 1% or maybe less than that. They could, in fact, if investment is higher, growth is higher, and it's possible U.S. inflation maybe more than 2%. I am actually taking it at 2%. Given the money supply in the economy actually, and the debt path that the Congressional Budget Office actually projects, it's possible inflation might be much higher than 2%. In which case, the currency actually might appreciate marginally as well. But I'm staying with my conservative prediction. But the historical depreciation of between 3 to 3.5 or 4% is something that is actually going to be a thing of the past. And in the book, in the preface to the book, what I actually say is there is a regime change in the rupee dollar that is brewing. I've been able to take tea out of it and actually serve it to my readers, but it is brewing. As a result, going forward, the depreciation will be 1% or less, and that's the big difference between the predictions that an E&Y Goldman Sachs is making versus what I'm making. They are projecting the rupee dollar based on the same past of 3.5%. In some sense, not factoring in the impact of the productivity growth and GDP growth itself on the international economic aspect or the currency itself. So that hopefully now I have few more people who actually think that what I'm saying is basically I'm not pulling a number out of my hat. It's actually well reasoned based on data. And to summarize, therefore, the inflation differential likely to be 2% lesser compared to what it has been in the past, and the real productivity growth being higher, and together with investment delivering higher growth. So if India can actually deliver 8%, and as I said, it's ambitious but achievable, India will be a $55 trillion economy in 2047. That tells you the kind of opportunities that you all have. And just as a side note for those of you who actually are thinking about where do you want to build your careers, and that's something for MBAs. Having myself been an MBA, actually, I can understand. It's very important. Let me just give you one. I'm sure you all agree that our salaries increasing are very closely tied to the nominal rate of growth of the economy. So if, for instance, the economy grows at X%, highly qualified professionals like us, our salaries will grow at least at X%, most likely more than X%, maybe 1.2x. Let's go with 1.2x. The US, you may start at a higher level in salaries, but you're going to get, let's say, 2% real growth. Fed projects it at 1.8%. Let's go with 2, just to keep round numbers, and maybe 2% inflation. So 4% is the nominal rate of growth. So your salaries actually might increase at about 5% per annum. In contrast, a country like India, where actually with 7% or even 7, let's take 7%. Let's not go to 8%. Let's take 7% as the real rate of growth and 5% inflation. You do the math. The nominal rate of growth comes out to be more than 12.5%. 12.5 multiplied by 1.2 is basically your salaries will grow at close to 15%. You may start at a lower salary now, converted into dollars converted, but when it grows at 50%, the power of compounding. I don't have to tell you that. So when you look at a 5% versus 15% salary growth, you see the difference. And this is especially intended for the Indians in the audience here. So think about where you want to work, because over the course of your 35-year career, you may be looking at very different salaries when so with that, let me just move on. And so that's the main message of the book. But let me give you some more color on, what makes me, optimistic about this. So let me start by telling you, this is a real story. So before I moved to the government of India, so I'm a professor on leave from the Indian School of Business. That's where I have tenure. So it gives me the privilege to be able to actually take jobs like this, and then knowing very well, even if things don't work out, I can always go back to that job. So which by the way, actually that gives me the courage to always to the powers that be to speak the truth to them. Not caring about whether I'll have my my job or not. I don't care, actually. I want to do the right thing. So but the reason I'm bringing up Indian School of Business is, if earlier, before I went and joined the government of India, I would step out for basically coffee, or coffee, tea. Actually, there's a small informal shop there, which would sell coffee for 10 rupees. 10 rupees actually, at that time is basically maybe if using, let's say, 50 to the dollar, maybe 60 to the dollar is actually 1/6 of a. So what we would do is that person would actually, so he's not making coffee from a machine like we are doing here. He's actually making the coffee literally. And in India we have this tendency to actually sort of run the coffee from one glass to the other actually, and that's how he does it, right? So he would make the coffee and then sort of take some maybe a minute or two out from making coffee in order to give you back the change. If I gave him 100 rupees, he would basically take that 100 rupees, look for change, and then give me. So you'd spend just about as much time making the coffee as he actually also took to give me back the change or other customers back the change, right? When I went back after, and having sort of done these, all the public digital infrastructure, being involved in that from the, at the macro level, I go in, so if after finishing, I go again and I speak the native language, so I can actually, talk to him about the change that I see is, he's selling coffee. Of course, it's from $10, it's become 15. But now he's not pulling out change anymore. I'm just pulling out my phone and using Paytm, or which is basically the, or Google Pay. And I just use a barcode and I pay him. So he is still busy making the next coffee while I'm actually paying him. And then in a speaker it announces saying, oh, $15 paid, thank you. So he knows that the money has been paid, but he's not having to stop his coffee making. So that's the first level of productivity improvement that has happened. He's able to make more coffees. Now customers are not having to actually wait for him. Related, and this illustrates the effect on the supply chain that happened. And I was talking to him, and he says, so the way it happens, because these are actually sort of cash and carry businesses. The person he comes and sets up shop at the VRs about 5 o'clock in the morning, maybe 6 o'clock in the morning. And then the milk supplier comes and actually delivers milk to him because he needs that milk to make the coffee or tea, right? Earlier, that milk supplier would come and deliver the milk, but he had to come back in the evening once more to actually get the payment for that day's milk. And why would he have to come back in the evening? Because that's when this guy would have made his sales. He has the cash to be able to pay so it's actually the accounts receivable there, the duration was actually, about 10 hours, maybe 12 hours, right? That's what that's how this business worked. Now, this person tells me, so I was asking him, how do you pay him now? He says, that milk supplier stopped making his second trip in the evening. Why? Because this guy is getting his, his payments in digital money. And he just, in the evening, when he's done his entire sale of, of coffee or tea, he just, sends him digitally. So that supplier now has also actually seen productivity, difference, productivity change. And tells you actually, so from the customer to the supplier, and then maybe from that supplier to, subsequently in the supply chain. This is basically, what is happening. And sort of just to buttress this point, in September, I was there in India, went with my mom, in this not very large town called Chandigarh in, the north of India. So I go there, actually went for grocery shopping with my mom, bought onions. My mom bought onions actually, and I think it was $37. And $37, the guy tells me actually that he doesn't have change, basically can't give me the $13 or the, $63. So I just pulled out the phone, paid him $37, and imagine actually now, it was unimaginable that somebody who's basically selling grocery, onions and potatoes and tomatoes actually is taking digital money. And why these sort of small grocers, even beggars now are actually, using digital, and there are memes floating around. That is actually the reality so what that means for credit creation, I think is phenomenal. For those of you who are, visited India, if you visited Delhi or Bombay, if you want to get some good fashionable clothes. You actually, in Mumbai, you go to Fashion Street. If, in Delhi, you go to Sarojini Nagar. There are these hawkers who actually, on the street, they don't have a shop at all. They actually will sell you stuff. They're just walking with their wares. That person also, they also take digital payments now. What does that mean for their business? Having been on the board of Bandhan Bank, actually, which is a microfinance institution, I've seen the kind of transformation that small credit can actually bring. This person, let's say 5 years back, he might have been selling, every month, maybe he's selling his wares for maybe $10,000, and so his income totally maybe is making $10,000 as profit every. So in the course of a year, maybe he's making 120,000 rupees. If he went to the bank, he couldn't convince the bank that look, I do actually earn 120,000 rupees, because the banker will say, where's the proof? I don't trust you. I don't think someone like you actually who's a hawker can earn that much, or maybe. But now if the banker says that I don't trust you, get lost. He says, pulls out his phone, take a look, this is basically my digital payments. This is what I've actually, these are this is the amount of money that has come into my bank account. This is what I've paid to my, the person whom this wholesaler from whom I buy shirts or tees or belt, t-shirts or belts or whatever. And look at my income. This is my income, proof of income. If you want 1 month, I'll give you actually 12 months, and now give me credit, right? And that's the kind of, and those of you who are entrepreneurial want to think about, ideas, basically credit creation, I think enormous opportunity, in the, so that's this is one of the key drivers of the India story. So, when I talk about how, and why India can grow at 8%, ambitious, but achievable, one of the key is basically, the digital infrastructure. I can tell you, for instance, during COVID, when we made payments to vulnerable sections, and we did a very targeted targeted stimulus. So the approval for that, in the cabinet gave the approval. The union cabinet gave the approval, I think, late afternoon. Within a few hours, the payments had reached the beneficiaries. Wow, we did that through the digital infrastructure, the combination of the digital identity, the phone, and the and the bank account. And by the way, this is I think even in the next 100 years, this is something that will be talked about, will be written about. Today in the poor, 500 million bank accounts, over 500 million bank accounts have been created. 500 million. Let that number sink in. It's actually 1.5 times the population of the United States. Last I checked, population was 350 million, 500 million bank accounts, and money actually, going into these substantial amount of, so except for about 10% of these bank accounts, so 50 million which are not active, the rest of the 450 million bank accounts are active. And that's the kind of, so the next few charts that I'm going to show you basically just gives you the data for the story that I told you about, the digital transformation that has happened. This is basically the, internet users in India. Look at the slope up until 2013, and look at the slope from 2014 onwards. I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I don't need to tell you anything more about how, if you look at this is basically in terms of smartphone penetration. So, number of mobile phone connections has saturated. Of that, the smartphone penetration, actually look at how it's been increasing, exponential growth. Then look at the digital transactions starting from 2018 onwards. This is in terms of rupee billions on the left, and volume of transactions, both of them actually, exponential growth. So this is basically what can lead to sustainable, inclusive growth in the economy, because unlike in the, in advanced economies where the poor cannot access this infrastructure, India has built this digital infrastructure as a public good. It's been created by the sovereign, and therefore the price for access is not as high as private sector would make it. I'm sure you've been taught in your microeconomics classes, that in perfect competition you have price equal to marginal cost, and when it's a monopoly, though, actually the price is much higher. Marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, and that leads to monopoly pricing. So when a private sector player creates that digital infrastructure, the pricing that he or she actually, or that company will do will actually be much higher than when it's created as a public good. And higher price will definitely mean exclusion. which is something that India will be able to avoid. So this is one of the key drivers for the prediction that I basically told you about. I'll finish my talk talking about speaking about the sui generis policy that India followed during COVID. Having been involved in this, I can actually speak from in first person. Some thoughts on, and many of you, I'm sure, you would have seen New York Times or Guardian and others basically talking about how in 2020 or 21 India is going to the dogs. They might have shown some funeral pyres burning in the second wave. Television says that India is really sort of not able to handle the pandemic, etc. Remember, actually, in a population of 1.4 billion people, even 140 million is 10%. So even if I actually pick up 1 million people, right, that also is so you have to I think scale is important when you start looking at that. So one of the things that India realized actually was with its health infrastructure, which needs a lot of work, and that's something that I will absolutely concede. But with 1.4 billion, and a pandemic is a network phenomenon. What does that mean? That if the pandemic spreads among, let's say, among a population of X people, there'll be a certain pace of spread, let's say Y. Now, if you multiply that population by 10x, so X, let's say in a population of X, the spread of, the rate of spread is, let's say, Y. In 10x, the spread will actually not be Y or not even 10Y. It'll actually be maybe 20Y because of the network phenomenon. I'm sure you actually understand, network externalities. Not just that. The other key point is that, India is among the most dense population from a population density perspective. Very, very densely, densely populated. I think Bangladesh is the only other country which has a higher population density possibly than. So in a dense population with actually 1.4 billion, the kind of mayhem that could have happened. And these were predictions made by Johns Hopkins University, Princeton, and others. And I was actually looking at those numbers, in March and April of 2020. They were basically saying, India is likely to have 40 million deaths a day. By May, the peak will happen, so India really had to actually think through carefully and not just mimic others. So not only did we develop our own vaccine, we also actually, on economic policy, we did not mimic the advanced economies. The reason we could not, mimic the advanced economies was, the United States has the luxury of having dollar as the reserve currency. Everybody else actually holds the dollar. Indian policymakers don't have any such luxury. Not just that, we got into COVID with sovereign credit ratings being the outlook being downgraded because of the growth decline. So and the sovereign rating for India is just investment grade. In other words, if there's one notch downgrade in the rating, we would go to non-investment grade. And I'm sure here MBAs that a lot of investments actually is based on. If it is non-investment grade, then portfolio companies mechanically have to pull out their money, and so we face that risk of having gone into COVID with the ratings being rating outlook being downgraded. We could not have the possibility of a ratings downgrade, and the ratings downgrade could have happened either because growth did not come back after COVID, because the original downgrade in outlook itself happened from the growth decline. At the same time, we couldn't have spent profligately either, because that would have meant our fiscal situation would not be good enough, and that would also lead to a ratings downgrade. And that's why India had to think through, on its own. And here I can tell you that around March, April of 2020, I remember agonizing about what this shock really is, what this crisis really is. During our PhD programs, all of us were taught that a crisis is always a demand side shock. That bit I knew very well, having gone and referred to the notes. But I remember agonizing that for the first time ever, I've never read in any of my classes or in any of the research before, where countries are asking their people to stay at home. That has to mean something. And what does it mean though? it took a while for that clarity to come. And when that clarity came, actually, the diagnosis that I came up with is that unlike the previous crises, which were primarily demand side shocks, COVID will be a demand and supply side shock. There'll be a negative shock to demand and to supply. And so if we then just do a demand side stimulus with a shrunk supply, you will get inflation. That is the reason why India actually followed the policy that it did. So this is basically an article that I wrote in the Times of India. When you look at 3-year growth rates, so taking into account the decline and the increase, for the top economies. So what you have on the x-axis here is the inflation, during COVID compared to historical average. So for instance, the United States historical average inflation, as I was telling you, was 2%. But following COVID and the Ukraine war, you actually had inflation touching close to 7%, 8%. So that's about 250%, 300% increase compared to the historical average. Germany close to 400%. So on the x-axis is basically the inflation during this period compared to historical average. Y-axis is three-year growth. In other words, taking into account the decline and then the rise back. And there, India actually stands out as the outlier. Every other country, large economy, falls on the line. In other words, the growth that they got basically was primarily from the fiscal stimulus. India actually, because of the supply side measures as well, has been an outlier. So these give you some of the other statistics. I'll be happy to leave the presentation, for you to look through. So, on a dozen metrics, if you look at even India's performance during the previous crisis, global financial crisis versus COVID, India did really, really well. If you look at, for instance, the currency depreciation was 56% during the global financial crisis, 0.06% during the fiscal deficit. Current account deficit, for instance, in that period touched about 5% of GDP. We had a current account surplus in the COVID year, and like that. So I want to end now by giving you the reason, as I just explained to you, and this is something which I'm sure all of you have seen in your classes. So think about, and this is a tool I always use, which is, laissez-faire. If nothing had been done in a crisis, what would have happened? And I think let me just spend a minute on this chart, and then the rest of it will start becoming clear. Think about so the blue lines here are the demand curves, aggregate demand, and the yellow lines are the aggregate supply. So those bold lines are the demand and supply that prevailed pre-COVID. So the economy was at this equilibrium, which the output at Q0 and price at basically this level, right? Now, as I said, and this is the part that helped me a lot, that diagnosing that COVID meant actually a shrink in demand, so that's the blue one, but a shrink in supply as well. So in other words, if basically governments did nothing, there'd be a huge shrink in output. Output would go down significantly from Q0 to Q1 because the demand and the supply shocks actually reinforce each other. But on price, there wouldn't be inflation. Why? Because on price, the demand and the supply sides would counteract each other. So there wouldn't be any, and this is important for you to then start thinking about what the advanced economies did and why there was inflation. So note here that supply is shrinking. So that dotted line is the new supply post-COVID. From here itself, you can see if, for instance, let's say policy brought back demand to the original level with a shrunk supply, what would you get? You obviously would get higher inflation, right? And that's what the next chart shows you. So this is the aggregate supply post-COVID. Demand is being pushed back through by giving checks. The US, for instance, wrote $5,000 checks for everyone, right? Demand comes back. So what do you get? You get a lower shrink in output, which is good, but you also get a huge increase in price. And at the macroeconomic level, that increase in price is basically inflation. And this is why you actually had in the advanced economies much higher inflation, and even in India during the global financial crisis. But during COVID, what India did was different from this. What India did was basically this, that we worked not just on demand, but on supply as well. So demand, yes, we brought it back, but we also brought back supply. And that is why we actually are, getting a much higher, kick on output from Q2, which would have been the output actually without any intervention. You get the demand side push and the supply side push reinforcing each other to give you a higher output, but at the same time, you don't get a a price increase because you're back effectively to the original equilibrium. So this was basically the thinking that, where India followed its unique path by investing both on demand side and supply side. Thereby, that's why we've gotten, the kind of growth that we've gotten without inflation. What I showed you in that, if you remember this first chart that I showed you here, what we got here was because of this. So that's sort of, as we go through, I think India will need many more policy interventions like this, well thought through, but taking into account the difference in the economic conditions. But I'm quite optimistic that we should be able to pull that, going forward. So, the Honorable Prime Minister has called this Amrit Kal, in native language, which is Hindi, which calls the golden era. The next 25 years for India is a golden period where our demographic dividend, I think, can really, we're at a sweet spot. Of course, that does mean that, good jobs are important. There's a chapter on jobs in the book as well. The digital economy combined with good economic governance will create sustained equitable growth likely to be higher than 7%. So if we get 7% plus, we're likely to be the second largest economy. But if you're lucky to grow at 8% and if we put in the policies, we could, with some luck, we can be the world's largest economy in 2047. So with those words, let me thank you very much once again. I'd be happy to take questions. Yeah.
Quick question.
Can you tell me your name?
John.
Yeah, John.
Thank you for being here today.
Sure.
I had a quick question. So you're talking about other countries did change the demand rate or have had policies to help with the demand.
Yeah.
Only doing demand, of course, led to inflation. Saying in India, there were measures as well for supply. Could you tell us more about what some of those measures were?
Yeah. For want of time, actually, I couldn't get into the details, but 2-3 key measures that India implemented. One, as I said, the government capital expenditure itself, infrastructure creation. So, one of the things, so the economists use this term called fiscal multiplier, but it's basically just jargon for, if the fisc spends $1, what is it that the economy adds to it? With what is called revenue expenditure, which is basically subsidies or salaries, etc. If the fisc spends $1, in the Indian case, the numbers may be different for other economies. In India, the economy accumulates between 92 to 95 cents. In other words, between 5 to 8 cents is basically deadweight costs. So you are investing $1, but the economy is getting only 92 to 95 cents. But if the same dollar is invested in capital expenditures, over the time of that, the capex asset that it pays off, the fiscal multiplier, the multiplier is actually anywhere between 4 to 6, depending on the nature of the asset. In other words, you're putting in $1 and you're reaping between $4 to $6. So that was one of the key measures by the government. Second, which was incredibly important, was the loans to small and medium enterprises, all small and enterprises, and urban poor who are also actually affected, but loans given with a guarantee overlaid by the government. So loans were given by the financial sector, but with guarantees from the government. And I just need a couple of minutes to explain how we thought through conceptually on this. I'm sure if you've taken classes in banking or financial services, financial intermediation, you would have heard these terms: adverse selection and moral hazard. How many of you have heard these terms, adverse selection and moral hazard? Okay, so at least a few of you. Whenever one approaches for a loan, I'll not use the jargon because others have not heard this term. By the way, if you haven't taken a class on financial services and are not familiar with this adverse selection and moral hazard, I think in the remaining time you actually should be taking a class. Adverse selection and moral hazard should not be seeming like Greek and Latin to you. You should know it. But what it essentially means is, when you have adverse selection, if I'm actually as a bank, I'm willing to give a loan at 8%, then borrowers who think that they should be getting a loan at 7% will not come. They will not basically borrow. But those borrowers that think that their credit is actually poorer and therefore they should be paying 9% or 10%, they will be the ones who will actually sell into the loan. In other words, the good borrowers basically don't come in, the poorer borrowers come in, and that's what is called the adverse selection problem. Moral hazard is where you take the loan and then you don't make adequate efforts to actually repay the loan. You may disappear for all you know, or maybe you might actually sort of put money elsewhere. So that's what is moral hazard. Now these problems actually always manifest with either come from information asymmetry. I'm sure you've heard information asymmetry, right? That's one of the, so both adverse selection and moral hazard stem from information asymmetry. What happens typically because of these problems is that banks are more than willing to give loans to people like us, during a crisis. We're not facing a credit shock, nor are we facing a liquidity shock, but they're more than happy to give loans to us. But the firms or individuals who are actually facing the shock, either their business is stopped or, they're basically poor people who are not able to supply their labor services, such people will not get a loan from a bank because the bank is worried that they will not repay. That's where what we did was we overlaid a credit guarantee, guarantee from the government saying that, if for instance, that borrower could be a small firm, medium firm, or could be an urban poor. If that borrower, does not repay, we'll foot the bill for it. So it's like, that's like insurance. In other words, insurance being given by the government. Now, what does that do? That does two things. One, because these loans are being given by the financial sector, and we all, companies and individuals care about their credit scores. So if you are in a position to repay, you will repay because you don't want a blotch on your credit history. So those that are in a position to repay, they will repay. Only those that are not in a position to repay, they will basically default. And for those people, the government guarantee kicks in. So in other words, you're essentially making a transfer to those individuals or companies that are indeed not in a position to repay. Thereby, you end up targeting the stimulus that you want, the money that you want. You don't want money to come to people like me, or you. And for instance, I'll give you an example. My daughter, was studying at the University of Chicago at that time, private university, which basically where fees are, these aren't poor kids that are coming to study there, right? She's not a US citizen, but her friends got $5,000 checks. What did they do? They basically went and put it in their bank account. That was actually just money completely wasted because it wasn't targeted well. But this way, the way I actually described, we ended up targeting those that actually needed. So what is typically adverse selection in financial markets, in banking, we turned it into favorable selection by overlaying the guarantee and ensuring that the right borrowers got it. And there was incentive for the firms to for the firms or the individuals to repay. That was the second key part, and both of them worked brilliantly in the. How are we doing with time?
We're slightly over, so
Okay.
I know you guys did not get your opportunity to ask questions. So what I'll do,
Maybe take one more question, and then just one more.
and what I'll do for the rest of them who cannot ask, please send your questions to me. I will compile them and send it over, and then I'll put forward the responses to you
Yes,
guys.
I'd be happy to answer questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a very interesting conversation. Thank you for that. The 55 trillion number that you've given is very intriguing because if I did some maths while we were talking. So let's assume that the base case right now is a 5 trillion GDP number.
Yeah.
Using the rule of 72, GDP effectively doubles itself every 9 years.
Yeah.
So if I work out the math till 2047, 9 years from now, at an 8% number,
Right.
is 2032.
Right.
Right? So 5 trillion goes to 10 trillion.
Right.
Another 9 years
Yeah.
is basically 41.
Right.
The 10 goes to 20.
Right.
And then you need another,
I think
and a couple of questions related to that.
My
So the
first,
math,
my first response is actually that you have, when you take into account the doubling there, you actually have to take the doubling in dollar terms.
agreed. So there is a compounding effect there. I understand that.
Yes.
But just from a mathematical perspective, I did the math.
Yeah.
You don't get to the 50 trillion number every 9 years. And what makes it even more difficult is that the base effect starts working against you, because at 5 trillion to go from 5 to 10 is a lot easier than to go from 10 to 20 and then from 20 to 40. And it also involves perfect execution as a country. Now in India, from what I know, there is a federal policy mechanism
Yes.
and there is a state policy mechanism.
Yes.
And like you correctly pointed out, like the state and the center are not always aligned.
Yeah.
So if you actually have a federal policy
Yeah.
which effectively demands that the states do something and you don't have
Yeah.
the same
I understand.
political party at the center, at the state, they're not going to listen to the center. How do you then deliver that 55 trillion number?
Okay. So let's firstly, I'll be happy to send you my Excel calculations. I would love if you had a little bit more faith on my arithmetic. I've checked those numbers again, but prompted by a question, let me go and check it one more time. But I'm quite confident that I have the numbers right. I think that the important assumption you're making is you're doing it with 9 years. You actually, the rate of growth is higher. The doubling actually will happen sooner. And
I'm also assuming that the economy is a 5 trillion economy.
I agree. I think so. Now the part that you're asking actually about the diminishing returns, I think that is. But as I said, see the important thing that you actually have to keep in mind. Oftentimes we're actually viewing from the blinkers that we have with what we've seen, right? We've been used to the U.S. economy actually with the the population that it has, its stuff. India with a population of 1.4 billion with the workforce, right? The diminishing returns will start kicking in if you actually have, as we economists call, the intrinsic versus the extrinsic margin, right? Intrinsic margin is basically where you only have to grow your productivity within the set of firms that are in the formal sector versus extrinsic margin. So implicit in the, in that diminishing returns that you have is the assumption that the growth has to happen on the intrinsic margin. But I think what is really important to understand is that for countries like China, which actually had growth, as I said, from 2007 to 2023 now, growth at close to 8%, a lot of growth has happened at the extrinsic margin. And when you actually have, what does that mean? These are jargon. It basically means more firms coming into the formal sector, which means they're actually going to be a lot more productive and will be using more investment. It also means even if you take the formal sector firms in India versus the formal sector firms here in the US, there's still a huge productivity gap that they actually have to catch up. So this is basically where the growth, really starts coming in. And I'm quite sympathetic to your, argument about the federal structure. The only point I have to tell you is, from 1991 till 2014, we had mostly coalition governments. Forget about coordinating with the states. Even at the center itself, it required enormous coordination, and yet the growth actually that was delivered, and when you got reasonable policy, was 7% plus. So I'm not unaware of the challenges that you're actually telling me, but at the same time, I think what I'm talking about here is, as I said, it's ambitious, but it is achievable despite the challenges that you've actually put. Okay. Thank you very much.
Please accept this small token of our appreciation from
My pleasure.
Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, that's from Thomas Jefferson.
In his center.
No, I understand. Thank you so much.
Thank you.